The West still quite doesn't know why war in Ukraine might happen, but it increasingly seems like it's happening. Now surrounded on three sides, the recent victim of a cyber attack that feels like a dry run to some, Kiev's trying to keep calm and rally support. NATO countries sending weapons and advisors while deploying fresh troops elsewhere in Eastern Europe. But that's small compared to the 100,000 plus forces amassed by Moscow. And for citizens of most North Atlantic Treaty Alliance members, Ukraine, well, it's far away. So here's the question. How far is the West willing to go? We'll ask about the leaders working the phones, Europe's reliance on Russian gas to make it through winter, and of Vladimir Putin, whose own hand can seem strong. Ukraine's in his backyard. He's built up a war chest thanks to high oil and gas prices, but also weak. Sanctions could hit hard. And it's anyone's guess how public opinion would react to that or the prospect of body bags coming back from the Western Front. More broadly, what to do when both Cold War superpowers view each other as giants with feet of clay. Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking about war at what price? And joining us from Brussels, Bernard Guetta, member of the European Parliament from Emmanuel Macron's La République En Marche party, the Renew Europe group in the European Parliament. Thanks for being with us.
Good evening. My pleasure.
With us as well, Anastasia Shapochkinka, lecturer in geopolitics at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. You're also the president of the Eastern Circles think tank.
Thank you.
Good to see you again. Good to see you as well, Craig Kapitas, contributing editor at Quartz, author of Bear Hunting with the Politburo. How are you?
Ready to hunt bear.
All right. From Geneva, Stéphane Monnier, Chief Investment Officer at private investment bank Lombard Odier, who's been crunching the numbers on all of this. Welcome to the show.
Good evening. My pleasure.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Let's begin with the latest, a press conference that broke up a short while ago in Berlin, and it was the French president paying a call on the German chancellor, Emmanuel Macron, who had strong words. We're going to hear him talk about how there will be a high cost for Russia if it does decide to attack. A high cost if they decide to attack. He even went further, Bernard Guetta, talking about the fact that there is asymmetrical warfare, a hybrid destabilization were the words used by Macron. Now, the French president raised eyebrows last week. That speech he gave, you were there perhaps at the European Parliament in Strasbourg. Where he talked about the need for dialogue with Russia. Some interpreted that as being soft on Moscow. He sounded like it was a tough line today, ahead of talks that are due to take place Wednesday in Paris. Was that standard Macron, or has he been clarifying his remarks from last week?
But you know, it was wrongly seen as a soft on Putinism. Actually, it was quite hard, but we have the European countries and altogether the democracies of the Western countries. We have to have two hands, one a diplomatic hand and a sanction hand. And I would say that the Western countries are much more united than it seemed, and that they will be much tougher than it seems also. And on the other hand, Mr. Putin, I would say, is weaker and weaker, and not stronger and stronger. And precisely because he's weaker and weaker, he's more and more dangerous and unpredictable. And so the situation is, quite frightening,
All right, Putin weaker and weaker and therefore more dangerous. We're going to pick up on that point. Before we do, let's listen to Emmanuel Macron talking. Again, it's on the eve of the first time in more than 2 years that the so-called Normandy format is meeting here in Paris. That is to say, the four countries, France, Germany, Ukraine, and Russia.
There is dialogue in the Normandy format on the Ukrainian issue and the Minsk agreement. And there is dialogue between the European Union and Russia. Each of these channels must be exploited as much as possible to re-engage Russia in a de-escalation process and obtain guarantees. Should there be any aggression, there will be retaliation and the cost will be very high.
Anastasia Shapochkin, your thoughts on the wording of Emmanuel Macron on the eve of, by the way, not just this meeting that's taking place here Wednesday in Paris, but the phone call the French president will have with his Russian counterpart on Friday.
I cannot agree with my opponent or our guest in Brussels that the words were sounding tough. Of course, there was an intention of these words to sound tough, but it is clear that neither the French foreign policy, whose strategic interest privileges rather partnership with Russia than confrontation with it, nor the French business interest, which has high stakes in Russia, in the energy sector, in the automotive sector, in the food and retail sector. We can go on and on along the list of the CAC 40 companies to name vested interests, including companies with very high state participation in their shareholding structure, who have high interests and a good relationship with Moscow. For France, definitely, good relationship is much more important than any wins, quote unquote, they could get from a potential conflict, and therefore they talk about de-escalation. On the other hand, Macron is also, for Russia, is also not just a friendly, France is not just a friendly power, it's a useful power. Macron's words about the reflecting a stable position in the French foreign policy about the need of a European defense, which is separate from NATO, not mentioning NATO, evoking that idea again and again, which is an old idea, is not in respect to this crisis particular, but that plays clearly into the hands of Russia, because that also underlines the division within NATO itself. That kind of shows that there is an attempt to promote its own political agenda and its own foreign policy agenda. And
at the press conference, he did, though, say that he was for a European dialogue and a dialogue through NATO, both, he said.
And a dialogue through NATO. However, we know, and especially we know that the recent urge to promote the defense alliance, European defense alliance, in addition to NATO maybe, but still separate from NATO, is also playing against the backdrop of the AUCUS scandal and therefore with the recent division and fallout between France and the US. That hasn't fallen on deaf ears in the Kremlin. The Kremlin is aware of these undercurrents, and the Kremlin knows that neither France nor Germany have stakes in getting into conflict with Russia. Well, neither the US has those stakes either. And US, which is privileging China, which has privileged China as its main new opponent and competitor in its own strategy, is also not interested in this. It's kind of reactive. Everybody's reactive in this conflict, and it's Russia who holds really the reins and who gives the agenda.
All right, Craig Capidis, of course, if the French are talking about a European path, it's because the previous president of the United States seemed to wash his hands of a lot of all of this, and the U.S. is not the NATO leader it once was in the eyes of Europeans.
A lot of talk, isn't there, Francois? Right? Am I right? We all hearing a lot of talk. The problem is no one who's doing the talking speaks or understands Russian. First of all, Russian leaders for centuries have viewed their neighbors as vassal states or enemies. You can look it up. You want to talk different? You want to think different? Go right ahead. Now, for the past more than 30 years, we had Bill Clinton talking Yaley hillbilly. We had Bush II talking Yaley Texan. Obama speaking about Russia in perfume. Trump spoke in ignorance, and Biden is now speaking weaselly, albeit, right?
3,500 troops announced for Eastern Europe, the arrival of the military equipment, that's weaselly?
What's happening right now is the sum of all the past 30 years. The predecessors of Biden's predecessors, miscalculations. And what is war but the unfolding of miscalculation? And that is precisely what's going on here. Russia holds all the cards. Why? Because America and NATO help them stack the deck. Where do we start? The Sudetenland adventure in Crimea? We want to talk about Georgia? Oh, we don't have the time. Putin's in control here.
He's in control for now. Stéphane Monnier, does it seem like Vladimir Putin is in control?
An advantage in this confrontation at the present time. You know, he has 100,000 troops, you know, at the border of Ukraine. Not really sure where he wants to go. You know, does he want really to invade Ukraine, or does he just want to create a corridor, invade Donbass and create a corridor with Crimea, which would be probably his objective. But on the other hand, you know, neither the European nor the American have the capacity or the willingness to project that much troops, you know, in that region to confront him.
But do they? So do they need to? I saw that Russia, yes, has amassed these huge foreign reserves over the as the price of oil and gas have been high. But we saw that the central bank was forced to pause that on Monday. It was a blue Monday for traders. The stock market tanked. It's lost 15% of its value since the start of the year. Russian bonds are soaring. The ruble is down. Does Vladimir Putin have the stomach, not if the West sends troops, we know that probably won't happen, but if they put the fix in when it comes to economic sanctions and take it to another level?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. You know, the Russian assets have suffered quite a lot since the beginning of this, but I think Vladimir Putin can stomach that. And don't forget that on the other side, there is an element of energy dependence, especially in Germany versus Ukraine. I'm not sure about what the rest of the winter is going to be, but the price of energy has gone up quite dramatically, and this has an impact, you know, on the people that are voting in the different countries. And bear in mind, we are talking about Macron, but Macron has also some presidential election coming, you know, in a few months. So in that sense, you know, Mr. Putin doesn't have that problem, and he can have take a longer-term view. And I think his intention is to create a buffer zone between him and NATO, and this is his aim to build this buffer zone. And I think he might achieve it in the coming months.
All right, I want to talk about this issue of energy, which is so central. But one final question about this press conference that unfolded in Berlin earlier. Bernard Guetta, 3 times reporters asked the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz why Germany was refusing to export weapons to Ukraine. It was only on his 3rd answer that he actually addressed the question to a degree. Let's listen.
Es gibt in schwierigen Situationen nur eine Möglichkeit dafür zu sorgen, dass die aufgelöst werden. Die Bundesregierung hat in den letzten Jahren immer wieder.
The federal government has always decided these last few years not to deliver weapons, and there are clear reasons that explain what has happened over the last few decades. At the same time, we have done a lot to favor the economic development of Ukraine with our own economic financing. This is within our international responsibilities, and we will continue that.
Auch im Rahmen der internationalen Verantwortlichkeiten, die wir haben.
So this is a country that's a major arms exporter, but not to Ukraine. Your thoughts on that?
But, you know, this question of arms export was and is very sensitive in Germany. And the Social Democrats, even the Greens, I mean the electors, are very upset with this very idea of arms export. And so I'm not surprised that the new chancellor is very careful about it. But nevertheless, let's not forget that the European, including Germany and France, and specifically Germany and France, are more and more united about the idea of very tough sanctions against Russia, against Mr. Putin, if he had the very bad idea of invading Ukraine. And so, again, I'm very confident that the Western reaction would be, because we are not sure, not at all, that Mr. Putin will invade Ukraine. He could, for example, he could recognize as an independent state the area of Donbass. And it would be quite a problem for everybody, not only for the Ukrainians, but for the Western countries. What could be their reaction in such a case? But no, if in case of full-fledged invasion of Ukraine, even Germany would have a very tough reaction.
All right, a very tough reaction, although, as Stéphane Monnier was mentioning, it's a lot about the natural gas, which is the variable. It's winter right now on a continent that gets more than 40% of its natural gas from Russia, hence the attention to the now completed but not yet in service Nord Stream 2 pipeline that's to supply Germany via the Baltic Sea. Alison Sargent has more.
Gas may not be flowing through the Nord Stream 2 yet, but the pipeline has been supplying discord to the west since its development was announced in 2015. The Nord Stream 2 was built to double the amount of gas already being transported directly from Russia to Germany through the Nord Stream 1. The pipelines run parallel to each other through the Baltic Sea and are owned primarily by Russian energy giant Gazprom. Nord Stream 2 was completed last year, but is awaiting certification from Germany, a process that has been temporarily halted over Europe's fair competition rules. The European Commission opposes the Nord Stream 2, concerned that it further increases energy reliance on Russia, which already supplies 40% of the EU's natural gas. For the same reason, the US is also fiercely against the project. They want to see it used by Europe to pressure Russia and not the other way around.
Gas is not flowing through Nord Stream 2 yet, which means that the pipeline is leverage for Germany, the United States, and our allies, not Russia.
Germany continues to stand behind the Nord Stream 2, but has suggested that halting it would be on the table if Russia attacks Ukraine.
It is clear that there will be a high price to pay, and that everything will have to be discussed should there be a military intervention in Ukraine.
Ukraine itself has long opposed the Nord Stream 2 since it allows Russia and Europe to bypass their network of pipelines, depriving Kiev of significant revenue from transit fees. Ukraine also argues that continuing to transport Russian gas offers an insurance against invasion.
Okay, so no one expecting the West to intervene militarily, and no one expecting at this point in time for there to be this kind of full-out war on the part of Russia. But if there is either what Emmanuel Macron described, hybrid destabilization, what response then? For the West, the nuclear option would go so far as to suspending financial transactions, the so-called SWIFT system. Is that something that's seriously being considered if, to borrow Joe Biden's phrase, if it's a small incursion?
Unfortunately, we have exact answer to how the West would react to a small incursion and a hybrid war in Ukraine, because that's been happening for the last 8 years, and the reaction we have all seen and could enjoy. Then, about the SWIFT system, that red flag, so-called, has been waved before, Russianized many times before. The reason it has never been enacted, and so has probably even lost its relevance already for the Russians, because they had about 10 years to prepare to react to this, is because, of course, the first people to suffer from something like this would be Europeans themselves, those very same European vested interests connected very much to the European governments.
But it works both ways, doesn't it? The Russians need the cash, right, coming their way.
but the Russians don't have only. Europe is the biggest export market for Russian energy, not the only one. China now is also a market, and Asia is also a market. It's not the same. It's not comparable. But Europe is not the only market. And how would Europe? What would it do? What would it replace then Russian gas with the U.S. gas? With what other gas? And it's possible, but it's not exactly yet foreseeable. And then as for the scenarios about making Donbass independent state or joining it to Russia, if Russia wanted to do that, it would have done that long ago. The whole reason for entering into Ukraine, doing the incursion in Donetsk and Lugansk, and leaving it just as that, as it has been done already in Moldova and in Georgia, is precisely to do that, undermine territorial integrity, not to redraw the territory. And the moment that undermining of territorial integrity ends, either through an independence of these territories or through their joining Russia, Ukraine then has its hands untied to join anything, NATO or anything else. Whereas today, it's precisely the reason Ukraine cannot even pretend joining any decent organization, because it cannot even guarantee its own territorial integrity. You'll have a hard time selling your apartment if you have a neighbor living on your balcony.
Stéphane Monnier, Germany gets 50% of its gas from Russia. And not to mention that the chairman of the board of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is the former chancellor. Is there any chance that the Germans would be ready to make the sacrifice of less Russian gas or no Russian gas in a bid to stop Vladimir Putin in Ukraine?
Well, I think first, it's a little bit ironic, the situation for the German, because I would say it's one of the mistakes of Angela Merkel during her tenure that she developed this pipeline, because initially, the gas was flowing through Ukraine and Poland. And the reason why they created Nord Stream 2 was to, not be dependent on Ukraine and Poland. But, basically, you are very dependent on Russia. So it doesn't really solve the problem. Now, I think the issue in this crisis is that neither Germany or France at this stage really have much of a say on what's going to happen. And, if their kind of security from a military point of view depends very much on the United States. So, whether Nord Stream 2 is going to be, operating or not is really a decision from the Biden administration much more than the German or the French or the European administration. And I think the Americans are also sensitive about the about the economic impact in Europe. So I think it will be like a last resort measure, a retaliation measure against Russia to completely cut Nord Stream 2. But this is not, impossible. It's probably, on the same line as blocking SWIFT for the Russian institutions.
Yeah, when he was briefed when he briefed the House of Commons earlier, the UK Prime Minister expressed, empathy with the hard choice that could be faced by the German Chancellor.
Right, and I just want to say a word or two in praise of Olaf Scholz, because last night in conversation with him, it was clear, as I've said to the House, how difficult this is for Germany. Nobody should be any doubt about that. But it was also clear that the new German Chancellor is determined to stand with the rest of the West to have a united front. And amongst other things, of course, Germany has made it clear that Nord Stream 2 cannot go. They can't take part in Nord Stream 2 if there's a Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Craig Capitas, do you share the empathy expressed by Boris Johnson?
My lord, where to start? Let's start with St. Angela Merkel. Are we allowed to say something that might upset St. Angela? St. Angela shut down Germany's nuclear plants. A noble decision. But boy, was that stupid. I can guarantee you the boys in the Kremlin were going like this, saying, thank you, St. Angela. What are you going to do next to help us? Then we have this thing, we have this fancy phrase, hybrid destabilization. That phrase doesn't translate into Ukrainian if you live in the Donbass, where they've been at it for 14 years? There is a war going on there, ladies and gentlemen, whether the politicians want to say it. Now, here's the deal. The Russians have made a decision that there is an occasion for war. It's going on. what the lawyers call a casus belli. The question is, will the West see this as an occasion for war, a casus belli? And as far as the Germans go, dare I remind them, I'm sorry, the Nazis did kill 8 million Ukrainians during World War II. Could you send down a little help, please, fellas? Come on, give us a break with all the politics here. Vladimir Putin reacts to strength. He doesn't react to weakness. And right now, the best that the West seems to be ready to send the Ukrainians is a couple of shipments of Kleenex.
Oh, come on! There's all sorts of equipment coming in from the UK.
Oh yeah, that's going to do a lot of good against more than 100,000 troops swarming in from probably 4 directions: Belarus, the Ukrainian border, up through the Crimea. I wouldn't, of course, and I wouldn't even be surprised if there were some incursions from Moldova. But what do I know? I know nothing. I'm not in the room with these guys, but I know how the Russians think. So they want Ukraine.
Bernard Guetta, if the Russians react to strength, then what is the point of those talks on Wednesday that are taking place here in Paris?
Well, those talks are a very good sign, because if Mr. Putin agreed to send his advisor to this meeting, it could mean that he's looking for a diplomatic solution. But I'm not sure at all about it, and nobody is sure about his decision, his will, and maybe even Mr. Putin is not sure about what he wants to do. But I would like to come back, if I may,
sure,
to the question of the sanctions. Obviously, the sanctions would be very costly for the European and even for the American, by the way. But it would be much costlier for Mr. Putin, because his economy is already rather weak, rather poor, and more than that, those sanctions would lock him in a tete-a-tete with China. And this situation wouldn't be good, neither for him nor for the country.
Well, let me ask you, because Bernard Guetta, on that point, we've been talking about whether Germany would be willing to see the faucet be cut on gas. Remember that there's an energy crunch on that's throughout Europe. Governments are scrambling to keep a lid on heating bills for households, and there have been measures like in France where they've unveiled this 16 billion euro plan to keep those energy bills low through the winter. We know it's still not enough, and we know there's a French presidential election coming up. If the bills do skyrocket because things do degenerate in Ukraine and supplies of Russian gas get sparser, what impact will that have on Emmanuel Macron's bid for re-election?
Well, I would say that every European government in such a case would subsidize the gas prices and even the oil prices. Of course, not only in France because of the presidential election, but also in Germany, in Italy, Spain, and so on and so on. But don't forget, let's not forget, that gas is very important for the European Union. But gas, I mean export of gas, is much more important for Mr. Putin and for the Russian economy than for the European economy.
Stéphane Monnier, you agree?
Well, maybe with a slight nuance. I think that gas is obviously important for Russia in export, but they have accumulated quite a lot of reserves. Their economy is not doing as bad as I think Mr. Guetta is thinking, and they have more stamina, I would say, in the sense that the power of Putin is very well established. One thing also that I would like to mention on this subject of gas is the fact that Europe doesn't have much alternative. Of course, the US would have liked to sell natural gas to Europe as well, but the infrastructure to receive that gas are not getting really much in place, and it will take time. And there is another element which is playing in Mr. Putin's favor, is the climate. He has also a time constraint as far as concerned, because Europe is much more dependent on his gas during the winter. And, we are already towards the end of January. So he has another 2 or 3 months where he has a strong hand. As and when we get into the spring or the summer, then his position will be a little bit weaker temporarily. And that's something that he should have in mind.
No.
Dr. Peters.
I think the question has to be framed differently. Does the West have the ability to go as full tilt boogie as Putin, to use a term? And I mean on the sanctions side, because NATO is not going to send in troops there, although they may regret that down the line. So what is it? What is the equivalence? What is the so-called marketplace nuke option to beat Putin?
Cutting off SWIFT?
Well, SWIFT is part of it. It's not as important as it once was, but there's another part, and you hit on this the other night in one of your programs, which is a terrific one, by the way. You start taking down the oligarchs, and you start shutting down like the Chelsea Football Club, which is owned by Roman Abramovich. These are Putin's quartermasters. These are the ones who give him money. There's lists of these people. We know who they are. You arrest them, you take their money, and classically, Putin has one of two options. He can pull back, or historically, Peter the Great and the other czars slaughtered them. They killed them. And indeed, Lenin killed all of his quartermasters who were giving the Bolsheviks all their money to support the revolution back in the day. So the question really is, and no one's asked this of any of the leaders, Mr. Macron, how far are you willing to go? We know for a fact that let's take a number. There are 5,000 properties in France right now with 25 billion euros worth of Russian hard currency money that we can tie to Russian oligarchs who are tied to Putin. Are you willing to go in and seize those properties and freeze those accounts? That's the question. That's how you hurt Putin. Putin is Meyer Lansky. He's a criminal lord with a big army that's about to do a real full-tilt invasion of Ukraine if you don't stop him.
Do you agree with that, Bernard Guettin, that we're not talking enough about those around Vladimir Putin and who have money in Mayfair or on the French Riviera?
But maybe the European leaders and the Western leaders, generally speaking, are thinking about it. They are not ignorant of the situation. They are not stupid. They are rather bolder and bolder every day. And we shouldn't underestimate their determination and I'm sorry, I cannot find the word in English. Their knowledge of the situation and their knowledge of the oligarch situation. Of course, we could do that, and of course, we would do that in case of full-fledged invasion of Ukraine. That's clear.
And what if it's a minor incursion, as Joe Biden again said the other day? Would oligarchs be targeted?
They would be, certainly. Certainly they would. And even maybe Mr. Putin personally.
Let me ask you...
Let's think about this possibility also.
Anastasia Shapochkina, let me ask you, because we're going to talk now about how public opinion feels about all this. In the case of the Kremlin, is Vladimir Putin concerned with Russian public opinion or the public opinion of those around him, the ones that Craig Capitas was describing in rather unflattering terms a moment ago?
The private opinion.
Is it no? Well, is it about those around him? He wants to show strength vis-a-vis his own domestic audience, more broadly, Russian citizens, or the inner circle?
This is just to address several points. When we're saying before that is that Mr. Putin not sure what he wants to do. I think Mr. Putin announced at several occasions over the last 2 or 3 months what he wants to do is very clear. It's not the question about Ukraine for Putin. It is the question of redrawing European security architecture through bilateral talks with the U.S. Very important to understand. Mr. Putin does not consider neither Angela Merkel
and if he gets
Olaf
those
Scholz,
written answers as he wants, and if they start that negotiation,
nor Emmanuel Macron,
will that be enough?
He doesn't consider any of these people as his equals. And therefore, tomorrow's meeting at the Normandy format, it is not at all the meeting at which anything can be decided, even in principle. The only thing can be accomplished through that meeting is pushing the hand of Germany and France to create more pressure on Ukraine to move on the Minsk Accords.
Precisely.
Just to move that little piece.
Strach.
But this is not the main goal. For Putin, the main goal is not Ukraine, is redrawing the overall architecture. And therefore, in the scenarios, when the Americans are thinking about different scenarios, the scenarios of invasion do not stop at Ukraine. Where will NATO really move if Estonia gets chopped off? Of 1 million people, a country small as a state of Connecticut, I don't know what we can compare it to. Then the second thing is that the sanctions are going to hurt the US. No, the sanctions are going to definitely hurt Europe. How are they going to hurt US? The trade turnover between the US and Russia is in hundreds of millions. Millions with an Amazon.
It's tiny.
It's tiny. If we don't count the ExxonMobil investments in Sakhalin and other places in Russia, the investments overall in Russia's importance for the US, it's tiny. Russian economy is weak and poor. Not at all. Macroeconomic indicators are strong. People are living in poverty. Poverty has increased after COVID. But today, look at the prices of oil and gas. Russia is riding on the way. It's like the same way it's been riding in 2007 after the Munich speech, the first time we knew that Russia is back from its knees, quote unquote. And China, of course, is going to be, has been portrayed by Russia as a counter to the US, as an ally of Russia, and to create a stronger united front against the West. And China has been playing into the hands of Russia perfectly well because these interests ally with its own positioning, and especially vis-a-vis the US.
Stash, would you agree that part of it is that Putin is actually scared of the Ukraine having a democratic country that's going to have a bigger GDP
this is exactly
right on his border?
Not so much about the GDP, because there Ukraine hasn't yet excelled, let's put it this way, but he is scared in terms of the political model. Because, of course, the people of Russia, what concerns Vladimir Putin is the political model. When they're looking, and what we could see that really works, political model inspiration, because Alexei Navalny, let me remind you, he had 30,000 followers, not followers on Twitter or Facebook, but physical followers represented across the region in Russia. Now they're all in prison or in exile. But just a few months ago, that was the situation in Russia before the elections in September last year. And they were physically running for elections, physically collecting themselves, collecting money, organizing people, and leading 100,000 demonstrations. This is what Putin is afraid of, and that's the public opinion that matters. Come back to your final question about public opinion in Russia. Yes, no, people are definitely fed up with Ukraine. War in Ukraine in general is no longer something that's popular. Putin is trying maybe to play the same card as before. Every time war is bringing Putin points. This war, not necessarily so. The public opinion does not reflect the appetite for war. However, is that the public opinion that matters? And if we talk about oligarchs and the dismantling them, Vladimir Putin will have to start with the harakiri, because the main oligarch of Russia is himself.
No, let me just bring in Bernard Guetta on this, because the question, I can put it the other way around as well. How much of a stomach does public opinion have in places like France for an escalation with Ukraine?
Well, let me tell you first that this is precisely because Mr. Putin is not interested only by Ukraine, but also by Poland and by the Baltic states, that the reaction of France, Germany, the European Union, the United States would be very strong in case of a full-fledged invasion of Ukraine. I repeat that, let's not underestimate the determination of the Western countries in this situation. And now about the stomach of my countrymen. You know, if there was a real crisis situation just in the middle of the European continent, I do think that the French public opinion would support the president first and would support the very strong sanctions.
All right, difficult to say because obviously we're not at that point yet. Bernard Guetta, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Brussels. I want to thank Stéphane Monnier in Geneva, Anastasia Shapochkina, and Craig Kapitas. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.